Hi, my name is Abby Dumas. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with a white lace top. I have I guess I would call them gold and silver circular earrings and brown hair in a braid over my left shoulder. Over my left shoulder, I also have a framed piece of art with a red frame, and to my right are a set of bookshelves. JD, if you'd like to
Oh,
introduce yourself.
oh, thanks. Hi, my name is JD Davids, and I am a white person with short brown hair wearing a headset that has a uh, extension for the microphone that goes in front of my mouth with a fuzzy covering. And I'm wearing a brown t-shirt, and my background is blurred. It's a off-white color that represents the room I work in Brooklyn, New York.
Thank you so much. And JD, thank you so much for being here and being willing to share your story with the Global Feminisms Project. I'm going to briefly introduce you, and then we'll move on to our questions. JD Davids is a US-based health justice and communications strategist working with national networks of disabled and chronically ill people. He co-founded Strategies for High Impact and its Network for Long COVID Justice in 2021. Davids has been an external expert advisor to the NIH, CDC, and local health departments, and has served as a strategist and organizer with many pivotal groups, including ACT UP Philadelphia, AVAC, the Coalition for a National HIV/AIDS Strategy, Health Gap, the Health Not Prisons Collective, the HIV Prevention Justice Alliance, Positive Women's Network, USA, and the US Caucus of People Living with HIV. As a queer and trans person living with myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME/CFS, long COVID, and other complex chronic conditions, he writes and hosts conversations for the Cranky Queer Guide to Chronic Illness, the Twitter and Instagram handle for which is @thecrankyqueer, all one word, sits on the board of #MeAction, and is a contributing member of the Patient-Led Research Club, which released the first comprehensive study on long COVID. JD, I thought we'd start by thinking about where you are today, how you would depict the journey that brought you to this point.
Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity and all the work that your project is doing. Today I am tired. It's been raining off and on, and that tends to trigger my fatigue. And also I've been feeling over the last couple months tired in a sense of like feeling the years of my journey more than I do sometimes as a person living with complex chronic conditions, and also as someone who spent a lot of my life centering HIV/AIDS activism. The monkeypox outbreak in the US and the harm that is happening that doesn't need to be happening, that's happening through government neglect and misplaced priorities, even amidst all the misplaced priorities and neglect that's happening with the denial of the ongoing COVID and long COVID pandemic. It feels very heavy and is bringing me back to other eras of my life where I feel incredibly grateful to have been a part of feminist and queer centering, world changing organizing. And also I feel tired, and I feel the loss of dead comrades who I would appreciate their wisdom at these times. So, and I feel also I feel a very strange, I feel myself at the center of this very strange paradox or irony at a time of incredible suffering and um, mass disabling of long COVID. The attention, insufficient as it is, but the attention so far that has gotten has already resulted in I've been able to access more effective treatments
Mm-hmm.
for my body, which holds a lot of labels of diagnoses that often are denied to others, um, but that are I've been able to get through private insurance, white skin privilege, and access to specialists that many don't have, but haven't been able to have been on as effective treatments as I am now, that I've already been able to benefit through um, attention being put where it has not been put before, when there were already so many of us who have infection associated conditions.
Mm.
So it's a funny time.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I am today.
So maybe we can take it apart a little bit and start with sort of where you see your advocacy journey begin, and then we'll lead that up to sort of where your long COVID journey began and maybe tie those together.
Sure. When I was I think second or third grade, my elementary school had a display in the hallway with
Mm.
construction paper that was about the winter holidays, and it talked about Christmas, where it said we do this and we do that, and that talked about Hanukkah, and it said they do this and they do that.
Mm.
And I was one of a handful of Jewish kids in the school, and um, I guess I've always been attuned to matters of language and power, and
Mm-hmm.
I refused to be in the Christmas play. So I think that's one of
There it was
my
born.
yeah. So and another early memory was going to a day camp when I was 5 or 6 years old, and having grown up in a very much majority white community, was in a day camp that included lots of white kids and a pretty substantive number of African American kids, and noticing how, I don't remember the specifics, but noticing tension around difference, um,
Mm.
and also how that changed my lens of viewing the community I went back to. So those are some of my early memories of thinking about that, as well as growing up um, mystified about gender and not really feeling like I was doing it right.
Mm.
Um, so my advocacy, um, beyond sort of individual acts of Christmas play resistance, started mostly when I was in college, in the late '80s, and I I was at Temple University and joined the
Mm.
Temple Coalition for Peace and Justice,
Mm.
and was learning. I was actually a women's studies major, which I have a degree in, and was trying to figure out how I could be, as an individual, a part of movement. And
Mm.
at the time, there was the where the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act had passed, which was the first state level measure of that era that was cutting back on access to abortions. And I was interested in advocacy, and I went to some meetings on campus that groups came in to talk with us, and I felt like all they wanted from me was my money or my vote.
Mm.
And I didn't have too much money, and you can't vote very often, so I didn't really feel like there was much for me to do. And then a friend of mine who had just graduated introduced me to ACT UP, the HIV
Mm.
activist group. And immediately, well, it was very appealing to me as someone who was starting to understand more about my own queerness that I hadn't understood before.
Mm-hmm.
And where I late a year or so later, when I started going to meetings, was immediately put to use, where everyone was asked sort of, yo, what should be in this press release, or what do you think should be in the sign, or come to this meeting and help make signs. And I really found a family and a community and a home there. And that's pretty much where I stayed for many years, and now have stayed also in terms of my um, many of my values and practices come directly from my work with ACT UP Philadelphia. I was an active
Mm.
member for about 13 years,
Wow.
and that really has formed much of who I still am today. So through the years, then I had always had some sort of chronic health problems.
That
Thankfully,
was gonna
not
be my next question.
yeah, not severe, but I've also come to appreciate over the last couple of years how much those chronic health problems as a young person did affect my um, ability to participate in things,
Mm.
my relationship to school, my sense of self. And when I was in my mid to late 20s, I started having more chronic pain and chronic fatigue. And it was intermittent through the years. And many of our conditions, which are named or unnamed, can be
Mhm.
intermittent. And then, but I started working less hours or working from home or trying to adapt or deal. And then um, when I was in my late 30s, around when I was turning 40, I started having some pretty scary stuff as far as body-wide numbness and
Mm.
some other things that led to a diagnosis of transverse myelitis, which is usually very acute inflammation in the spine that leads to rapid paralysis. That hasn't happened in my case. I've had it multiple times without as much severity and more slowly. And that then led to a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, which was
Mm.
then changed later to a diagnosis of something more rare, which is called neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorder. And then adding on chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm sorry, what was that called? Chronic fatigue syndrome, but my diagnosis was for ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis,
Right.
or often shortened to ME/CFS, and then fibromyalgia. And then I got COVID twice and have long COVID. All of my chronic conditions, some of which can be quite severe, I have mild to moderate.
Mm.
And in many of them, long COVID, everything's sort of atypical because so many things can be a part of it. But many of the other conditions I have, I'm in some ways atypical for them.
Mm.
So that's my situation of atypicality. And I've also
Mhm.
had atypically good access to care that's denied to
Mhm.
many people.
Mhm. So you mentioned that you had COVID twice. Can you describe a little bit that timeline, the first experience
Yeah,
that you had
sure.
with COVID?
Well, I'm in New York, and I thought that I would get COVID rapidly, and I had a sense that I would be okay. And uh, what came first for me was gathering online with other chronically ill and disabled people and our allies, and realized that there wasn't anywhere for people to sort of talk about what was happening, and we were being talked about
Mm.
as everyone who counted was going to be okay, because this was most dangerous for supposedly people with comorbidities and old people who
Mhm.
don't matter. And so
Mhm.
we
Mhm.
gathered, and I helped pull together a webinar on March 7th of 2020 that was, I think, the
Wow.
first of its kind, which was about the coming pandemic in the United States and considerations, concerns and questions and suggestions of
Mm.
chronically ill people. And then on uh, March, I'm sorry, yeah, March 16th, I felt really good. I didn't feel as sick as usual. And March 17th, I got a fever. And throughout my 10 days of being symptomatic for COVID, I actually felt less ill in some of the aspects of my chronic conditions, less
Mm.
chronic pain, less congestion, different kinds of fatigue, less of some, more of another.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
then as the fever subsided in the last couple of days, those came back. And then I don't know if I had some aspects of long COVID. Then when a person has complex chronic conditions, there's a lot of ebb and flow. I know I didn't have severe long COVID, that's for sure.
Mhm.
The second time though, I mean, I felt like I probably had some sort of enhanced fatigue. I was having some trouble with word finding
Mm.
and names. And it felt like I have some damage to my voice, harder to talk loud and things.
Mm. Mm.
The second time I got it happened, well, the order is On February 23rd of 2021, I got the Moderna shot.
Mm.
At 3 a.m. on February 25th, I passed out in my home and broke my ankle. And the next day, I spent about 8 or 9 hours in an emergency room,
Oh my gosh.
and needed surgery. So when I went for pre-surgery assessments the next week, they found out I had COVID. So I either had it before the vaccine, I got it at the vaccine site, which was also doing testing and a kind of
I
a
see.
small, not very ventilated place, or I got it in the ER where there wasn't very good masking going on. Good compared to today's standard, but
Hmm.
so I got ankle surgery 2 days later. And I know I did not have severe COVID. I did not probably have moderate COVID, but it was having just had surgery. It was confusing what my symptoms actually were.
Right, I
And
bet.
yeah, after that, I had more, it was more clear. I think I had long COVID as far as like much more brain fog,
Mm.
um, more trouble with words, more reactions to food, and other things, as far as like a lot more problems with like watery eyes and congestion and
Mm.
GI trouble, digestive trouble, a lot of things. And much of which has been helped now thanks to learning about treatment for MCAS or MCAS, mast cell
Hmm.
activation syndrome, from other people with long COVID. Um, I actually now have less brain fog, less fatigue, and less GI trouble than before COVID,
Mm.
because this stuff was probably going on before for me and was exacerbated by COVID. And even though I've had excellent care, no one has ever talked to me about MCAS. There's
Mm.
now much more to do, but more awareness of it, because it seems like a huge percentage of people with long COVID may have it.
Wow.
But probably a lot of us with ME, CFS, and other conditions do too.
So you've mentioned your excellent care, and the privilege of having excellent care. Did you find that your experience with long COVID was made easier having those pathways already set, or?
My experience with long COVID was made easier by COVID-19 long haulers, people with long
Mm.
COVID.
Hmm.
And I've been a part of body politics since the beginning, or almost the beginning, because of already being involved in COVID, and then before it was called long COVID, but like
Right,
long, chronic COVID advocacy.
right.
Like, and so I know from my experience with being an HIV advocate, even though I don't have HIV, my friends and loved ones with HIV um, have always helped each other survive,
Mm-hmm.
or helped each other die in ways that people wanted to die as much as
Mm-hmm.
possible when that was
Mm.
possible. And so I knew that peer support that includes, um, looking at the research, figuring out medical options, information on how to navigate providers, all of that was going to be coming from the people who were affected themselves. In the
Mm-hmm.
case of long COVID, many of the people who are affected are healthcare workers,
Mm-hmm.
and researchers, scientists. So are also among those who are affected, because so many people are affected. So there was a lot of peer knowledge. There's a lot of specialist knowledge that has
Mm-hmm.
now met peer knowledge, and that's where I got the most help. And I got the most, to be honest, I got the most help in a way by not having severe long COVID. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. I know that there's very few ME specialists, and one of them is someone who I'd been able to see in the past, and she is now a lifeline for many people with long COVID. So I would have had
Mm-hmm.
access to her, presumably
Mm-hmm.
for severe long COVID, um, if needed.
What, in the end, were treatments that worked best for you?
Well, overall, in the trajectory of my life with complex chronic conditions,
Mm-hmm.
um, I don't know what works best for me, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm very uh, humble, or I'm very aware of how easy it is to mistake sort of cause and effect, and
Mm-hmm.
so, but in terms of my and also I don't know of all these conditions I have that are named. I have one body and one life in this one lifetime, and it's all me. And I don't know that there's actually distinct conditions, so to speak. I think, and especially, in the case of, if you look at what happened, for example, there used to be a lot of things called multiple sclerosis, and then as more tests were developed, things get separated out, and distinctions get made. And, I don't know what is what, but what I know is I seem to have an immune system that in some ways is overactive and in some ways not active enough. I know that I tend to get a lot of run-of-the-mill colds and viruses frequently, and it would take me longer to shake them. When my kid was a toddler, I got a lot of those toddler conditions, that adults don't usually get. And I know that what helps me feel better um, and function better has been trauma therapy, somatic therapy that's helped me with trauma, and um, gender transition. When I started as someone who lifelong has identified as gender queer, I haven't always had the language, but as a tomboy or gender queer or trans or whatever, there's many words I've used through the years, but my decision after I gave birth to a child to then go on low dose testosterone was started because I have data at the time that I don't know what it led to in the research world, but it was about potentially that they found that for cisgender women who had lower endogenous levels of testosterone had more flares in multiple sclerosis than those who had higher levels. And so looking at that, and then looking at how many autoimmune conditions are much more prevalent in quote unquote women, I started on the low dose testosterone and then decided to do a more sort of comprehensive hormonal transition to stop cycling and to adopt a hormonal mix that was more frequently seen in cisgender men. And I was psyched about some of the secondary sex presentation changes that came with that. So and I feel that those two things, when I talked to my neurologist who was treating me for that NMO, that most dangerous rare condition I had or have, and I said, I'm doing the gender stuff, and I did this trauma somatic therapy really feels like it has really changed who I am, and I'm going to go off the immunosuppressive infusions I was getting. I was taking rituximab, and actually this was years ago, but part of why I wanted to get off was because I was afraid there was going to be a pandemic.
Wow.
Yeah. And and he said, well, you have mild or atypical disease, so I'd prefer you to stay on, but what I really think is your guess is as good as mine. And so he didn't disagree. He didn't say those were therapeutic, but he thought it could be a good guess. So those have been helpful. And then, now I take a mix of, I always mean to count, but it's at least, I think, 25 different treatments, most daily.
Wow.
Many are over the counter, but many are not. And some come from, there's one from a compounding pharmacy. There's one from a different mail order pharmacy. I take a hormone suppressor that's from a specialty pharmacy, as well as taking testosterone and over the counter stuff. So my day-to-day management of my relatively mild but super life-changing chronic conditions is pretty consuming and hard. And so even in an almost best case scenario like mine, it's important for me to say it's really hard, in terms of I'm always running out of something, and my partner has type 1 diabetes and a seizure condition between the two of us, and also does gender confirming hormones. So, but we're always out of something, and it's a strain. It's a lot, and it all could be a lot easier. And it's really clear that things sometimes are as difficult as they are because it just makes another dollar or two here for some or another company to have it be just that much more complicated, or to get just that much more out of my insurance, or for my insurance to get just that much more out of having to pay for things. So I don't remember what your question was, but that's my
No,
answer.
this was great. It all answered the question about what has worked and
Oh, also another thing that has worked that's been important to me is a 12-step recovery.
mm,
Um, as a sort of a program of belief that's fairly, agnostic, at least as practiced here in Brooklyn,
hmm
that I can opt in and out, that
mm,
doesn't cost money, that there's a
mm.
lot of ways. Hello. There's a lot of ways to participate in it. For someone who, has a lot on my plate, that's been also really life changing and affirming. And so my medical conditions are physical,
hmm
and that's really important to say and recognize.
hmm
And dealing with the physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and political aspects of my
hmm
conditions,
hmm
these are some
hmm
of the things that have helped, um, as well as um, peer support and being a part of social movements.
Wow. One of the themes that seems to be emerging in the conversations that I've had is the importance of rest and pacing. Was that part of your daily regimen pre long COVID? Is it part of it now? Where does that fit into
Well,
the range of self care things that you do?
after I broke my ankle, I had to be in bed for pretty much 3 months.
Wow.
And so that was the first time that I ever really rested like that. But still, the way I was resting was far less intense and intensive than people with moderate to severe or very severe
Mm-hmm.
ME or long COVID. I did things like I, watched things on the internet. I read books. I did
Mm-hmm.
crossword puzzles. I
Mm-hmm.
typed a lot, and so coming up through AIDS activism, where some of the stuff that people would say is sort of like, well, you sleep, we'll fight AIDS. There
Mm-hmm.
was this real feel of like people were not going to live. And while they were alive, they were going to give all they had.
Mm-hmm.
And that was an ethos that was for all of us, whether we were living with HIV or not.
Interesting.
Um, I feel like part of what kept me in and drew me to act up was having been raised in an abusive, chaotic household. I
Mm-hmm.
was ready for, and sort of um most familiar state was that of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so joining a movement that was really fueled by crisis and at a crisis pace
Mm-hmm.
is something that I did for many years. And when I think about what was happening, in the months before I got most acutely ill, years later with transverse myelitis, I can look at the pace now that I was going and see how hard it was. And
Mm-hmm.
I have never really methodically used pacing, and I have a relationship with rest that is uh, characterized by trauma responses.
Mm-hmm.
That rest can feel dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
and so I am, for whatever reason, having mild to moderate atypical presentation of these conditions has allowed me to only reach a certain level of progression um, in a very like hectic overworking life like I had up to the point of when I got the transverse myelitis. And then over time I have learned more about resting and pacing, um, and now years later, um, I I neither work like I used to nor do I want to.
Mm-hmm.
you know
Mm-hmm.
I think my sense of resting and pacing, it tends to be more sort of intuitive than scheduled.
Mm-hmm.
um and I also there are also times, though, I mean, it just happened a couple days ago. It's happening less frequently since I started the MCAS treatments, but where I do have to suddenly go lay down and
Mm-hmm.
I have to go to sleep. um and I I have had very long stretches in my life where I have been able to not worry about working, like living collectively with people and sharing expenses in an
Mm,
anarchist collective house that meant I didn't have to work
mm,
much for money, through a bunch of my 20s. Like I have often had these sort of like bursts of being working a lot, and then bursts of having a lot of choice about the work I do,
mhm,
that I think is also a form of rest in my life that has to do with
mm,
having sovereignty over one's own time and body.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and so I that's my long way of saying, no, I don't rest in pace, but I have a very restful life
mhm,
now.
mhm,
And I have, particularly over the last 3 years, or for the foreseeable future, I have a much smaller life.
mm,
And I already had only gone out to a nightlife event once or twice a year for years before. I don't really want or need those things too much. So um for many people, who say, for example, that they've recovered from long COVID, when you talk to them, they then say how careful their life is now and how different
mhm,
it is from their life before long COVID.
mhm,
So really
mhm,
what they've done is they've adapted to long COVID. And that does make real changes. It
mhm,
makes real changes. It may even eliminate some symptoms entirely, or some of the conditions that have been unmasked or added on by long COVID. Um, and so that's my situation. I know that, I'm pretty sure that, if I add much more on, like for example, when I started the network for long COVID justice,
mhm,
I did kind of work myself sick again. And I
mm,
started having a lot of trouble eating food, like, and trouble sleeping. Like a lot of it was coming back. And I it showed me that I can't do it. Even though I
mhm,
was feeling
mhm,
much more healthier, I still take a lot of care and tending to stay that way.
mhm.
Yeah.
Really interesting. So you sort of mark the beginning of your long COVID advocacy on March 7th,
Yeah.
2020. What was that? What's been that trajectory over the last 2 years?
Um well, I started in January of 2020. I launched the Cranky Queer Guide to Chronic Illness.
Okay.
And that's something I talked about for a long time, of wanting
Mm,
to sort of document my path,
mhm,
where I've had this pretty incredible life of being like in this super queer liberation um, path, and been involved in world changing HIV activism, like helping to
mhm,
get HIV treatment to tens of millions of people worldwide, and um, working with a lot of incredible people who are no longer here, or who may be here, but haven't really, that not many people have heard of them or know of their incredible work.
mhm,
And as well as a lot of what I've learned about coping with living with complex chronic conditions.
mhm,
And so I think there's also a lot that we have to share, like and we get I my last job outside working for myself before this was, I worked for a digital health site,
mm,
and I'd never done that before. And I learned a lot about how the reasons that digital health information, um, the site I work for notwithstanding, which is quite good, but how
mm,
it's really almost completely shaped by profit motive.
mm,
And because the US, you can have direct to patient pharmaceutical advertising, and how we're chopped up into these little boxes by diagnosis or specialty or lack of diagnosis. But
mhm,
when you get down to it, for the vast majority of any of us with chronic conditions, like there's something wrong with our pooping, our
mhm,
digestion.
mhm,
We're struggling with sleep,
mhm, mhm,
or fatigue, or various aspects of that. We have to deal with decision making about what treatments to try,
mm,
when to stop them, when to start them, dealing with side effects, looking at drug interactions, what to do with all the barriers put in place. It makes it hard to get this stuff. There's so many things that we have in common. And so I started a I named it a concept called elder, that we are
mm,
elders. So we are, no matter our age, we have a wisdom from being disabled and chronically ill.
mm,
And
mm,
so I wanted to share elder wisdom and get elder wisdom from others, and have
mm,
queer conversations about the sort of life and times of the activist movements I've been able to be a part of. And so that was the spirit through which I then, you know, helped do that gathering online on March 7th and move forward as the Cranky Queer. And then what happened was I got pretty pulled in, pushed myself in, or fell in to long COVID advocacy because I'm in this fairly unique situation of having come up through not just HIV activism, but I've done a lot of research advocacy. And I have that there's a lot of HIV researchers who work on COVID too. Like there's a lot of overlap, and there's all the health inequities that we had expected would happen that are really, you know, so true still in HIV, and that are really appallingly evident in the ongoing COVID pandemic. And I have complex chronic conditions where I know what happens as far as people who get a virus and never get better or get differently sick, or, you know, all these ways it can happen. So I ended up just being in conversation online with a lot of people with long COVID who were in these groups. And that it's funny because I say people with long COVID because I'm used to saying people living with HIV. Many people with long COVID say COVID-19 long haulers or long haulers, and or patients. There's a lot, you know, I'm part of patient-led research collaborative, and people talk about long COVID patient leadership and patient advocacy. That doesn't quite roll as much off my tongue, in part because I know from ME, the vast majority of people with ME and the vast majority of people with long COVID are not patients and can't get care and don't have a diagnosis, or maybe don't even know that they're sick because they already have comorbidities. They already have a bunch of chronic conditions. They're in communities where diabetes, hypertension, different conditions are the norm because there's such a there's a lot that is in terms of how our society runs that is disabling people, particularly Black and brown people, immigrant people, particularly trans women of color, other trans people, are put in harm's way to be made disabled and then made to work at low wages despite disability, you know. So this was already here. And so so the patient, I very much support, you know, patient advocacy and self-advocacy, but the Denver Principles, which was written, I believe, in 1982 by people with AIDS, that says, it starts out by saying, we are not victims and we're only occasionally patients. We are people living with AIDS. So this was the origin of that nomenclature that has been so important in my my liberation work, is that people were saying we're not patients. And in fact, a recent a big campaign right now, years, you know, generations later, among led by people living with HIV who I work with and support, is in the for the federal government, the US government, to have indicators of how to evaluate how well the efforts to treat people with HIV are going based on quality of life indicators. Because for over a decades now, it's been, are people virally suppressed? Because if you're on effective HIV treatment and the virus is suppressed in your body, you can't transmit to others. So if that's the measure of how people are doing, it may leave out tremendous aspects of their life that are tremendously important regarding living with HIV that have to do with stigma, isolation, precarity, food insecurity, loneliness, that don't get measured, interpersonal violence. And so particularly, you know, many women living with HIV have been fighting for this, to say, don't just ask me about how my virus is doing, ask me how I am doing, right? So that is something that I think, you know, as we go forward in advocacy as and for COVID-19 long haulers, you know, I think it's so important to understand that as the movement does in the groups I'm working with, of that, you know, it's not just those who are able to say, I have long COVID, because being able to say I have long COVID is a privilege. And sometimes it's about race, class, private health insurance, family support. And in order to move forward of the health justice movement, a health equity movement, I believe we need to establish comprehensive care for all complex chronic conditions, regardless of a diagnosis or lack of diagnosis. Any person with fatigue deserves care and support for that fatigue, even if they think COVID isn't real, even if they are my political adversaries. They still have the human right to health, even though they would deny that to me as a trans person. I want them to get treatment for their fatigue. And I don't want them to have to say, I have COVID, particularly if saying that is going to lead to violence in the home, loss of custody to your children. There's reasons why people can't say they have long COVID. It could mean risking your employment, which that means losing your home for your children. There's a lot involved with saying publicly, I have long COVID. Everyone can and should, but just with HIV, it's not for me to say who should or shouldn't disclose their HIV status.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So to answer your question, I started working with a bunch of these groups that come together, including I was already, I think right before the pandemic, I think I joined the board of ME Action, which is the a grassroots-based ME patient-led or community-led group, and I helped to I didn't do research on the wonderful initial research of patient-led research collaborative that confirmed and described long COVID, was the first real comprehensive report in the world, as far as I understand it. But I helped push to emphasize patient-led as part of what this report was, and have been hanging out there ever since. And I've worked to introduce some of the leaders of Body Politic, the online support group that patient-led grew out of, and members and leaders of patient-led research collaborative to leaders in HIV research advocacy, both inside and outside of NIH, and so make those connections. And then I had the privilege of getting to talk with and hang out with the two women who started Marked by COVID, which is a organization started by a woman whose dad was killed by COVID, but killed by the politics that encouraged him to go out there and get COVID, and her partner. And so our groups, plus the wonderful super grassroots COVID-19 long haulers advocacy project, which was started by Karen Bischoff, who's a indigenous single mom who got COVID during some of the training for her work as an EMT in Florida. So our groups, I was just so moved by these groups, and also they looked familiar in how things get started, and they're all way underfunded, and people are working as volunteers in ways that could even jeopardize their own health, and so I wanted to help. And I saw that some of the work I had been doing and still am doing is I work as a strategist with national networks of people living with HIV primarily, and helping to figure out organizational structures and working practices and campaign priorities and plans that help move these networks forward. And so I wanted to help bring that to the long COVID groups. And as I was starting to do that, and I was like, I really want to help these groups, they're overwhelmed and there's so much to do. And then pretty soon I realized, oh yeah, this means I'm going to get overwhelmed. Oops. So I was able to volunteer a lot of my work over the past year because of a COVID-19 small business loan. And which was a privilege that was unequally distributed, across the United States. And it's not a big amount of money, but I was able to continue to develop my group, which is Strategies for High Impact, which supports national networks and also to some degree does some international work and local work to support networks of disabled and chronically ill people. And so that's what's helped us start the Network for Long COVID Justice, which is was co-founded by me and my comrade, Gabriel San Emeterio, who is a queer and gender nonconforming person who's a Mexican immigrant in New York who's living with HIV and myalgic encephalomyelitis and other complex conditions. So we're working to support anything we can do to help groups be able to collaborate together or find the way forward. And we'll see what we're able to do.
Wow. And that
Yeah.
was founded, when was that?
Well, we officially founded Long COVID Justice in the beginning of 2022. We started
Okay.
working on a little 2021, but Gabriel and I have been working together for probably most of the pandemic at this point on some of the HIV projects, other things.
So you mentioned the familiarity of the landscape as you came into long COVID work. I'm curious, with your deep and inspiring history with HIV/AIDS, what was similar there, and what has been different?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, by the time I started doing HIV advocacy activist stuff, when I joined ACT UP, it was like 1991. So AIDS as a syndrome or had been known about since 81. So it was 10 years in, right? ACT UP started in New York in 87, started in Philadelphia and many other places in 88. And so for one, like people started before there was ACT UP, there was, people with AIDS supporting one another and people particularly in the gay community, but also in communities of drug users, helping each other in daily life, and at the end of life. And but as far as like organized groups, like that wasn't as early on. And so that's one thing I think it's important to recognize, is just how very early on it is. And there's the familiarity is people coming together and figuring out what they need to do, and also people who had not before had to rely on a medical system or public support, having this eye-opening experience or having this new experience of like, oh, this is awful, and it's been awful like this for some people all along. So it's a transition that gives people an opportunity to re-examine their own sort of positionality in a patriarchal, racialized, capitalist horror show. So it's an opportunity for people to meet at the place of principles and values, to try to understand what they can do to change things for everybody. And the large scale of long COVID, looking at the large scale of HIV, these are the kinds of things that do reveal or should reveal the drastic inequities and the essentially the unsustainability and inoperability of profit-driven, racist, and gender discriminatory medicine, social programs, and government. So it's a moment, right? And I think there's a I often turn to a speech that was delivered by HIV activist named Vito Russo several times, who was in ACT UP New York. I didn't know him, and I think the speeches were made maybe before I was involved, but it's called Why We Fight. And he talks about living with AIDS is like a war that's only going on for those in the trenches. You look around and another bomb has dropped, you've lost more friends, but people who aren't in the trenches don't know what's going on. I'm paraphrasing. It's not because it's not happening to them. And later he says, earlier he says, if I'm dying from anything, I'm dying because not enough rich, white, heterosexual men have AIDS for anyone to give a shit. So I thought, oh, wow, COVID's going to affect everybody, and including white, rich, heterosexual men. And things are going to change now because it's
Mm.
widespread, and
Mhm.
then it really hasn't. I mean, it has shown, and more have seen, I believe, the need for everything to change, and it has shown the incredible power of the state, and
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
profit is going to trump everything, and
Mhm.
that profit will demand fascism if that's what's needed in order for capital to keep on its trajectory, right? So that's what we're seeing now. So that's different than my work in HIV, where I think
Mhm.
I'm not much of an optimist, but I think there was part of me that felt like the horrors of the AIDS epidemic, which continue in different ways to this day,
Mhm.
but the acute horrors of intensely high death rates and unmitigated suffering would be different if people were
Mhm.
affected differently,
Mhm.
like when there was Legionnaire's disease,
Mhm.
happened at the same time that HIV was starting around, and everyone jumped on it and figured out what to
Mhm.
do. And that didn't happen with all that was going on with HIV, that kind of thing. Oh, now
Mhm.
it's going to happen. That didn't happen. So
Right.
I'm feeling a lot of despair. And I think also what I witnessed as a HIV negative, from the privileged position of being HIV negative, but amongst my comrades who were living with HIV and living with AIDS, particularly in the era before effective treatment, was people really felt that being a part of advocacy was very helpful to their health, and people
Mhm.
would be a part of advocacy even as it became clear that they likely were not going to live a lot longer.
Mhm.
And it helped people stay connected and be in a supportive community. And because people with long COVID, basically many of them have ME,
Mhm.
and it's likely that ME is exacerbated when you first are, it's first revealing itself, or you first sort of acquire it. The language on how to describe it to me is still not clear.
Mhm.
That deep rest actually could be the most important thing to
Mhm.
avoid
Mhm.
chronicity and avoid progression.
Mhm.
And the deep rest, the lack of it, could harm people. I think
Mhm.
that creates a real challenge in terms of a
Mhm.
social movement
Mhm.
where I it's both a challenge and an opportunity, because the reality is we need to have liberatory movements that aren't endurance tests, and we need to have
Mhm.
liberatory
Mhm.
movements that are deeply infused with suffused, I don't know the word, surrounded by
Mhm.
disability justice.
Mhm.
And because not even if it wasn't the truth that disability justice, which says that all bodies are worthy and all of us contribute in ways, whether they're recognized by capital or not, that are valuable, and all of us are um, deserving of circumstances to contribute in ways that are good for our bodies and our spirits.
Mhm.
um, we extra need that for long COVID, because people could be cementing in place lifelong illness and disability.
Mhm. Mhm.
The other thing, though, I think we need is to more and more support for what it means to live with lifelong illness and disability,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so as much support as possible for people to be as well as possible in any
Mhm.
state of mind, body, or spirit.
Mhm.
And if the biggest challenge, I think, across the board for many people with long COVID, and I should say I'm often not speaking of the most severe, because it's a whole level of intensity that I can't speak for or characterize, and that
Mhm.
often gets sort of um, left out when you're talking about severe or very severe ME or long COVID. So I want to make clear I'm not doing that.
Mhm.
For those of us who have intermittent or mild or moderate presentations, like the the biggest challenge is income and life, and being able to provide for ourselves and our families to have a place to live,
Mhm.
food to eat, um, and so without I think that the one of the real things we should be winning from this pandemic that we've needed all along is universal basic income. That's the treatment we need for so much of long COVID, in addition to, in a way that would be truly inclusive of all people, regardless of race, location, gender, immigration status, but to have the basics of our life covered so we have the option to rest. Without that, I fear that we end up blaming people for their own recovery or lack of recovery. Like it's seen as if you've gotten better, it's because you've done the right things and you're good. And if you're not getting better, it's because you're not doing self-care and you're bad,
Right.
and you've done something wrong. And I think we have a really the importance of an accountable and principled long COVID movement rooted in disability justice is huge as we look at what's going to unroll in the next couple of years. Because what we're going to do is there's probably going to be potentially, for some people with long COVID, there will be biomarkers found that explain some aspects of long COVID. So
Right.
those of us without biomarkers, and I say that as someone who lacks biomarkers for like my most major diagnosis,
Right.
will be even, they're sort of left out in the cold and disbelieved more. And if there's some treatment and some people either can't get it or don't respond to it or can't tolerate it or can't fit it in, then it'll be our fault for not taking the treatment. There's going to be all kinds of divisions. Or if you take the treatment and you don't get better because you already had existing comorbidities and chronic illnesses, like you're not deserving. Or if you had, if you have fatigue because you have ME, but you didn't have long COVID, are you going to get that treatment? Are you going to be on the indication when FDA approves the treatment? Is your insurance going to have to pay for it? There's so much that's going to go down now, that the best case scenario of understanding long COVID and finding treatment is going to include a tremendous amount of problems. So even the best case scenario should be a huge, like the idea of what will happen with the best case scenario should be a huge call to everyone who can support long COVID leadership in groups that isn't now, which is to say pretty much all funders, with a few exceptions, pretty much all of government with few exceptions, should be supporting to build up the infrastructure of leadership of people with long COVID embedded in their own communities that were most, affected by COVID and long COVID, that already have high rates of disability and chronic conditions, to be ready, to be ready to ensure that if we have a best case scenario that actually is good for people, all people with long COVID, and to do everything we can to ensure we do have that best case scenario.
Wow. So to sort of synthesize some of the really powerful things that you said, would a hope for a vision be not only, you mentioned earlier, support for care for anyone with fatigue, with or without a diagnosis, universal basic income, some sort of formation of sort of mutual aid healthcare networks to support folks, particularly in areas and communities most hit. Would there be anything else that you would add to that list?
Yeah, I think that to really center caring and to really develop the caring economy is something we all need. And so I think that, thank you for synthesizing all that. That was very helpful to me.
No, it
But
was all you, beautifully laid out. I'm just
we need it. Yeah, we need it for all. This is what healthcare should be. Like if you look at diabetes, is the greatest example of why there's no guarantee that things will go well at all for long COVID. What we need for diabetes is there's proven programs at the community level, for example, for type 2 diabetes, which I'm talking about now, which, by the way, there's rising rates of it, particularly in children, but also in adults as a consequence of COVID, right? So there's more type 2 diabetes. And so low cost, community led programs that are about cooking, about eating, about ingredients, and about understanding diabetes that then help people get also medical care, but also just like sort of activities of daily life and support to care for one another. Greatly reduces rates of diabetes complications, of amputations, of suffering, right? And so what we need for long COVID, we need for diabetes, which people think is, so well known. And so, and of course we need free insulin, and so we have this very incredibly effective treatment called insulin that people can't get or have to ration test strips. And when you open the canister for the test strips, they fly all over the place because the manufacturers can't be bothered to spend a couple more cents to have them all in a strip or something that just feeds into the machine automatically, because they can't be bothered to give up that any ounce of profit. So we need to have community-based care, and I love the doula model. Doulas are people who help people with transitions. So community doulas who can help people with a new diagnosis, with an emergency, with a gender transition, with a community, with a family crisis. Doula care of people who know your community and care about you and your community, who can come and help wash some dishes, can help look after your kids so you can get that care you need, and you can be trusted with you could trust them with your kids. And to then for people who need that, all the time, to have no shortage of in-home services and support, and to have these be good living wage jobs where people get training, where people get union protections, where people have the rights that it takes to be able to do these incredibly vital jobs, and have their own health be protected. And then to have all this community care is networked through, centers of excellence that are continuing to develop the science and treatment for common co-travelers and chronic illness, like fatigue, like digestion, like what's going on with microbiomes and such, and that research is deeply accountable to and led with community participation and community participatory research. And then implementation science, which is the science that looks at what happens when you take this research out into the real world. Does it still work? What makes it work? What makes it not work? That also creates paths of employment and promotion and education for community folks to become the primary investigators, to become the PhDs, to become the scientists running the show. So yeah, that's basically the plan that I think should happen.
I love it. It's really wonderful. I guess as we think about wrapping up, one question I want to ask, and then I'll open it up for you to make sure we hit everything that you wanted to talk about, is you talked early on about your awareness of language and power and how you have navigated queer spaces. I wonder how you now understand the term feminism, how that's changed for you over time, and whether you consider yourself a feminist.
Yeah, I consider myself a feminist, so that's the easy question. And as a feminist, I believe in unlimited gender equity, and that unlimited by also any preconceptions of what gender is, and I feel like when I was growing up, I was born in the end of 1967. And so, the word feminism was around in the landscape, though I grew up, I was in high school in the 80s in a very deeply gender discouraging time. And as someone who really did have to perform gender to sort of learn how to be a girl in ways that didn't feel very right for me. So I really did. I didn't know there was any real alternative so I had to sort of work at it, and working at that almost cost me my life as a teenager, in terms of drug use and sexual risk taking, and compounded by harms as someone who was abused by a female relative. The gender complexity is very real, and so feminism, coming into an understanding of feminism, particularly I had the incredible good fortune of I went to college and went to an introduction to women's studies class that was taught by Sonia Sanchez, who's a visionary Black poet and liberationist, and seeing my life be able to like re-understand my life, thanks to learning feminism in the years that I was able to dive in college, like really saved my life. So I think I would say feminism saved my life.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't know how I would define it now. And I think that I actually, I really like to understand more about like how what do we do to change to disrupt dominant narratives, and what dominant narratives about feminism can be disrupted through language and through actions and through so it's not an area of inquiry I've been able to like live in for a long time, but it's something that's very important to me, and also seeing my child's generation now. My child's almost 13, and seeing the both the power of some gender freedoms that they have and their peers have, but still the tremendous pressures that come from a gender binary. It's really intense, and so I'm feel really eager to like learn in this new generation, how I can be of support and in pushing further, also in as a trans parent, and with young trans people in my life, how do we do that? So I'm excited about feminism, though I don't know how I think about it as a term. I mean, I embrace it. Yeah.
JD, is there anything that you wanted to mention?
Well, one thing I want to mention is about language and narrative and power that I've been working on, and that I think is, I mean, one of the things that one thing we've been working on is we have a statement called "Pandemics are chronic," and one thing that has been so vexing but so instructive is, even amongst people who are some health equity advocates and people deeply involved in social determinants of health, have talked about COVID in binary ways. And when I first learned about what binaries were as a young feminist, it really helped me understand the world a lot better. That for whatever reason, binaries may be a handy thing for human brains, or something encouraged socially and politically by those who benefit from them. But there's this binary of COVID, was people talked about, there was either you got COVID and you either died or you got better, and they weren't incorporating, people were advocating for vaccine equity, for example, or talking about the huge disparities amongst COVID rates and fatalities in Black and Brown communities. And there was not much recognition of COVID is chronic. And chronic conditions do sort of break apart a binary. And so we wanted to put out the "Pandemics are chronic" statement as a pledge for people to say that they will talk about the chronic aspects of COVID and all pandemics, because now and there's been discussions of a pandemic preparedness, what we need to do next time, that didn't
Mhm.
talk at all about chronic conditions that come from pandemics. And if
Mhm.
you think about it, AIDS is like long HIV,
Mhm.
or like ongoing
Mhm.
HIV disease,
Mhm.
now it's long HIV.
Mhm.
And pretty much, it seems like probably maybe all viruses, if not all, can have a chronic component, some more than others. With
Mhm.
polio,
Mhm.
post-polio conditions can surface decades and decades later. We
Mhm.
don't know if that may also happen with COVID.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the importance of understanding that pandemics are chronic
Mhm.
is a feminist pursuit,
Mhm.
because it
Mhm.
breaks apart the binary of
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
sick, healthy,
Right.
like um alive, dead, right?
Mhm.
Like
Mhm.
there is living with chronic conditions, there is the chronic ongoing need for care,
Right.
and to be able to move forward now in this moment of the third year of COVID and not talk about and every aspect of whether there's going to be a pandemic coming or there's new pandemics, or looking at, no one is asking, like, is monkeypox chronic?
Mhm.
Can there be chronic sequelae? Or for
Mhm.
people, maybe even most commonly, for those of us who have chronic conditions or disabilities, things that may be more transient in other people may have chronic impacts for us.
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
know, they
Mhm.
may, make us, our chronic conditions worse, or
Mhm.
they may linger longer enough to put us in jeopardy from something else that comes down the pike,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
pandemics are chronic says that there's an opportunity here to recognize what has not been recognized
Mhm.
before.
Mhm.
When we look at chronic Lyme,
Mhm.
when we look at ME, which is often associated with viral infection, um, or other conditions that that aren't even necessarily named, but that chronicity itself, I think, is in some ways perhaps a feminist concept, because
Mhm.
it's about
Mhm.
it's about not oversimplifying. It's about looking at what happens to everybody
Mhm.
in reality, not just in like fairyland stories or like stereotypical ways. And it's
Mhm.
about a need for that life is about care and caring for one
Mhm.
another and
Mhm.
ongoing care. And
Mhm.
so, even if there wasn't long COVID, we would have chronic impacts of COVID-19 in bereavement, in
Mhm.
grief, in
Mhm.
disruption of family structures, in
Mhm.
the losses that have happened. That alone is chronic impacts, but
Mhm.
we have probably about at least 1 in 5 people who's had COVID has some sort of long COVID.
Mhm.
So the ease with which even those who, um, with whom I am generally politically allied, sort of were not intrinsically talking about the chronic aspects of COVID,
Mhm.
led us to, put out the pandemics are chronic statement, which we hope people will still sign on to. And,
Mhm.
but it also speaks to just how easy it can be to overlook things sometimes, especially acute COVID's really bad. This pandemic
Mhm.
has been very bad,
Mhm.
but it's also chronic. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I wanted to make sure I say that.
Thank you so much, and it feels like a really powerful way to come full circle end to
Yeah.
end. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to interview you. Thank you for the honor of spending the last hour and a half with you. We're really thrilled to have your interview as part of our Global Feminisms project, and I know we'll all benefit greatly from it. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been an honor to be a part of this and to get to have help sort of connecting my own history um, with the important work that's happening today. And I would also encourage people to check out the US Positive Women's Network. It's a national network of women and people of trans experience living with HIV,
Okay.
as a great intersectional, powerful feminist group run by Black and brown women living with HIV and trans people. So check that out too.
We will for sure. Thank you so much.